Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the Director of the Americas Program here at CSIS. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a conversation with Dr. Rahul Gupta, Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Before we formally begin, let's talk some logistics. This event will last approximately 60 minutes. Following the moderated portion of our discussion, we will field questions from the audience. If you are joining us today in person, please submit questions by scanning the QR code that you can see on your screen at the moment with your cell phone camera. For our virtual audience, please submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions link on the event webpage. Please note that a recording of today's discussion will be made available immediately after on the event webpage. Again, good afternoon. Domestically and globally, the challenge of illicit narcotics is one of the defining threats to public health, safety, and our shared prosperity. Today, the drug production and trafficking landscape appears to be further complicated by the long transition between traditional plant-based narcotics and rapidly emerging synthetic drugs, most notably fentanyl, which continues to claim tens of thousands of lives to overdoses each year. While fentanyl and its analogues continue to devastate lives and communities across the United States, plant-based flows continue apace. Coca cultivation, in particular, has increased dramatically between the years 2021 and 2022. These two categories of narcotics each carry different implications when it comes to the kinds of interdiction, public health approaches, and international cooperation responses needed to rise to the various challenges successfully. The United States cannot pursue a successful counter-narcotics strategy without support from allies and partners either. While the Western Hemisphere is home to some of our strongest and longest-standing allies in this regard, today the counter-narcotics consensus appears to be somewhat frayed. Renewing this consensus requires, of course, acknowledging and learning from past mistakes, but also continuing to bolster some of our cherished partnerships on the ground. Navigating this transition period also means re-examining common misconceptions when it comes to counter-narcotics strategy, which has long hinged on the false dichotomy of supply versus demand reduction, when in truth, both are vital to any successful U.S. response. Supply reduction efforts to halt drug flows at the source and interdicting them before they reach users, as well as offering robust public health approaches, have important roles to play. Furthermore, an underappreciated element of the fight against illicit drugs is the nature of the criminal groups themselves, which today operate in a startlingly similar fashion to multinational corporations. As we will discuss today with Dr. Gupta, disrupting these groups' access to revenues, equipment, as well as distribution networks is one of the most important and effective ways to reduce the flow of illicit narcotics. To unpack the ways in which the United States is responding to the shifting international narcotics landscape, we are truly honored to host Dr. Rahul Gupta today, Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Practicing physician of 25 years, Dr. Gupta most recently served as the Chief Medical and Health Officer, Interim Chief Science Officer, and Senior Vice President at March of Dimes. In his role, Dr. Gupta provided strategic oversight for March of Dimes' domestic and global public health efforts. Dr. Gupta has served under two governors as the Health Commissioner of West Virginia, where he led the opioid crisis response efforts and launched a number of pioneering public health initiatives, and led the state's Zika action plan and its preparedness efforts during the Ebola virus disease outbreak. So without further ado, please give me a hand in welcoming Dr. Rahul Gupta.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Berg and CSIS for hosting today's discussion. When the Office of National Drug Control Policy was created almost 35 years ago, the United States was confronting a very different drug environment. In fact, up until recently, the country's drug supply was dominated by plant-based drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, or synthetic stimulants like methamphetamine. Now, these drugs were created, refined, packaged in crude labs, and moved through illicit distribution systems and processes managed by established hierarchical drug trafficking organizations such as Mexican drug cartel. They found their way into our communities, into the hands of Americans struggling with addiction, as well as other issues that people were struggling with, like trauma and poverty and other things. Our response back then was fairly straightforward and limited. The United States believed that illicit drugs created by criminals, moved by criminals across borders into our communities, demanded a law enforcement-centered approach. And with supply reduction as our guiding principle, around 90% of the drug control budget was dedicated to the efforts of interdiction and seizures, 90%. Now, we've learned so much more since then about developing a more targeted and better supply reduction efforts, as well as the importance of public health. We're currently in a very critical period of transition. And I say transition because where plant-based drugs of the past are still, as Ryan mentioned, being produced and still harm way far too many Americans, but we're also seeing the emergence of illicit drug environment dominated by illicit synthetic drugs like opioids, like fentanyl and its analogues. These drugs have sparked a significant and rapid shift in how they're produced, how they're trafficked, and how they're even consumed by Americans, whether they're witting or unwitting. Today, you no longer need, for many, acres of land, of cocoa or poppy to produce drugs. All you need is just a chemistry set, basic fundamental knowledge of chemistry, the internet, and a room small as a closet to produce some of the most deadliest drugs ever produced on the face of the earth. And today, drug traffickers really do not any further rely exclusively on illicit pathways to move their products, but rather reap those profits through a global illicit drug enterprise that operates on the back of the very same legitimate supply chain that moves money and goods across borders with incredible speed. Now, there are some who would say that we have already emerged from this transition, or that we should focus only on synthetic opioids. Unfortunately, we do not have that luxury at this time. Instead, we've got to maintain the pressure on the cultivated drug supply, while at the same time develop and execute a response to the overdose epidemic that is being driven by synthetic opioids, and it's complex, and it is as dynamic as the drug environment that we face today. And it is with that that the Biden-Harris administration is meeting this moment with a strategy that disrupts the production and movement of these drugs across our borders so that we can relieve the pressure on our public health system, in which we have invested already billions of dollars and removed barriers to access, expanded care. We've reduced harm from these drugs to save lives and also increased treatment, as well as for those who are entering recovery that we need so desperately today. Now, the President's drug control budget today that is proposed is about $46 billion. That's true, billion with a B. And just over half of which is today dedicated for reductions or demand reduction. And it's for the first time, it also includes concepts like harm reduction. You know, ONDCP has learned a great deal from its past 35 years of drug policy. And we know that we must complement our efforts at reducing availability of these drugs in our communities with also providing high-quality, evidence-based public health interventions to reduce the demand for these substances in America. But it cannot be just one or the other. Let's be very perfectly clear. Addiction as a disease, it must be treated. and trafficking is a crime that must be punished. So the administration is now taking historic steps on the public health front. We've removed, as I mentioned, the barriers to treatment so that millions of doctors today now can prescribe medications to help people with addiction. We've expanded access to naloxone, an overdose reversal drug for opioids. We're partnering with Ad Council so that every parent and child in America knows the dangers of fentanyl and what to do about it so they can be the hero and save someone else's life. Now, on the law enforcement side, the administration is developing and deploying a new technology across ports of entry to interdict these drugs before they cross the border. This is going to deny drug producers and traffickers the profits they want, as well as the operating capital they need to sustain their illicit business. At the end of the day, drug traffickers really want only a few things. Here's what they are. They want to reduce their production costs. They want to reduce the risk of interdiction. They want to increase their customer base. And above all else, they want to increase their profits. We have to understand that. And to accomplish this, they require a universe of raw material brokers. They require illicit finance facilitators, lawyers, accountants, and corrupt officials. And targeting only the heads of a few organizations will have a temporary effect at best. Of course, we're going to continue to do that simply because they deserve to be brought to justice. But we must also place increased emphasis on the thousands of facilitators who drive this global illicit business and keep this global supply chain alive. Now, with this in mind, we've adopted a strategic approach called commercial disruption. It treats supply chain as a business that it is, and it targets the critical elements of these criminal enterprises with a greater number of tools, applied in a much more strategic and sophisticated manner to disrupt the global illicit supply and its chain and deny these individuals access to raw materials, access to operating capital, as well as the profits. It ultimately reduces these dangerous substances across America's communities. But we've also got to bear in mind that the United States has borne the brunt of this problem alone, oftentimes, for the past decades, one which has now become global in nature. I often tell my international colleagues that today you can divide up the entire world into three types of countries. Those that have a synthetic problem and know about it, like the United States. Those that have a synthetic problem and don't know about it. And those countries that are about to have a synthetic problem. Addressing the synthetic issues is going to take a global effort. And the United States is exercising its leadership on this issue. And the progress that is being made in the global community includes at the 66th Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the United States delegation that I co-chaired with Ambassador Todd Robinson. We introduced a number of bilateral and multilateral initiatives to disrupt the global synthetic supply. Next month, Secretary Blinken will be hosting a ministerial-level conference of the Global Coalition to establish and agree upon the global community's response to the synthetic drug threat. Let's just face the facts. Illicit synthetic drugs are the most pressing drug threat to our collective health, to our well-being and security of all the nations. And for the United States, it is a national security, it's an economic prosperity issue, as well as it's a public health and law enforcement issue. With a sophisticated strategic approach that's being guided from the White House that provides a unity of purpose across federal government, and through strong bilateral relationships with key countries like Mexico, Colombia, India, as well as attempting to work with People's Republic of China, and by exercising strong global leadership, we're going to meet the challenges that the production and trafficking of synthetic drugs present to us. Now, we can disrupt this global supply chain. We can hold criminals who produce and traffic these deadly drugs accountable. We can also prevent these drugs from killing our citizens and provide help and hope to all of those who are impacted. And we can keep families and communities as whole and make sure that loved ones are still there at the dinner table, at birthdays, holidays, and at life's most important events. So thank you for being here for this most important discussion, and I look forward to having a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for being here and for those remarks. I want to start this portion of our conversation today with some of the recent news that came out of the trip of Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the People's Republic of China. One of the things that caught my attention was the announcement of a potential working group with the PRC on chemical precursors. Tell us a little bit about what that would mean, how that would factor into the ONDCP strategy of commercial disruption.
Thank you, Ryan. We're approaching the PRC in this way. First of all, obviously, you've seen a number of sanctions that are coming out from the Department of Treasury for the illicit chemical companies. At the same time, Secretary Blinken is working and will be announcing the Global Coalition meeting. As simultaneously, we want to make sure that PRC understands that there are things that they can do right now that will help us not only follow global norms of shipping, but at the same time address the illicit actors within the PRC today. That includes having protocols for shipment, what we call the KYC or Know Your Customer protocol. So these precursors now shipped and bought and sold by brokers in between. We're actually getting to know who we are shipping them to. Similarly, shipping manifest, labels, proper labeling. So you're appropriately labeling and holding folks accountable. And lastly, understanding the amount of shipments of particular chemicals that are going to the third party. So you have an idea. These are, we believe, doable asks. We're willing and wanting to have that communication and work on this. So we're committed to doing everything. We know that there's a new ambassador to the United States, and we're going to be reaching out to see if we can begin that conversation here in the United States, as well as in Beijing.
So I want to drill down a little bit on the strategy of commercial disruption, which you laid out in your remarks. You also talked about how we're at this critical moment where we still have plant-based, but we also are moving into the new frontier, which is the synthetics. So how does the strategy of commercial disruption disrupt the supply chains of both of those very different types of substances at various points along the supply chain?
Yeah, in some ways, as a physician, I could tell you, you could have, I tell often people when they have more than one condition, you can have ticks and fleas. You can have both. And that's kind of the interesting problem we're in, right? So I think this is precisely the reason that we're looking at commercial disruption and profits as the backbone of what feeds the lifeline of these traffickers and producers. If we go after the money, it's going to be really important whether it is plant-based or synthetics. What drives these organizations and individuals and their consultants is the profits and operating capital. So that's the common link. And I think if we pursue that direction in choking off the supply chain, as well as going after the particular financial instruments and mechanisms, is the way that we're going to be able to have progress and success in the future.
So on the question of fentanyl, we saw 100,000 fatal drug overdoses in 2021. About 70,000 of those were attributed to synthetic opioids. How does the ONDCP approach the fentanyl crisis? Talk to us a little bit about the strategy of commercial disruption. What does it look like for fentanyl specifically? Because I think there are a lot of folks in the audience who probably be interested in your response there.
Yeah, I think if It's about the global supply chain. We have to really look at this as commerce. So when we talk about fentanyl, we're looking at precursors that are being shipped for countries like China, like India, at a lower level, but still there. So on one hand, we have to look and work with host countries for these criminal elements. At the same time, working with shippers, oftentimes they're non-US based, consignment carriers like FedEx, UPS, DHL, and USPS. At the same time, that if you follow that track, then it gets turned into powder, and then it gets turned into pressed into pills. So another choke point is pill pressers and dye molds. That's another piece that is coming through a lot of times from China, and looking at regulating those. And then the financial instruments, the financial, both the operating capital as well as the profits that they seek. So if we are looking at that, this is a precisely reason that we're seeing so many of these Chinese illicit chemical companies being sanctioned now, as well as individuals. It is important to go after the entire system. One of the things we find is oftentimes real estate agents, brokers, and accountants may be very important. The reason they may be very important is because oftentimes the brokers might be same for multiple cartels and multiple illicit actors. So it's really important to get at that as opposed to only follow individual actors there.
We often create this false dichotomy, which I mentioned in my opening remarks about interdiction on the one hand, public health on the other, when in reality both have vital roles to play. So you mentioned 50% of the budget for ONDCP is dedicated to demand reduction. So I do want to ask you questions about public health, also because you're the first doctor to hold this position. So my first question would be, how do you think you approach the position differently than some of your predecessors, given your background?
For I think half a century, we've sort of pursued drug policy, oftentimes having so many different forces trying to push one direction or the other. And all of my experience, what I've learned is it's often more complicated than one would think, and it requires often multiple prongs of strategy. But behind that, I think it begins by sort of dismissing the compulsory binary argument folks would often put you in, which is it's either public health or public safety. So when I look at this beyond the 2, 4, 6-year election cycles, as someone who's trained in public health and medicine, I look at this as we're having the lowest birth rate on record in this country. We're several percent below where we need to have just to maintain the population. We're having declining sort of life expectancy at birth right now. We have this is the number one cause for people dying in working age group. So this is really a threat to national security, but also economic prosperity and public health. There's no way we can look at this as a public health problem or a national security problem. And so we have to take an approach that addresses both at the same time. And as President Biden likes to say, we're the United States of America. Whatever we put our mind to, we can accomplish. So we have to work together. That's the important piece of the message that I carry with me all the time and fortunately, this is one area where most Americans and so many people in a bipartisan way on Hill do want to work together.
Let's talk about treatment for a second and other public health interventions. What role do they play in the overall strategy that you're trying to implement?
Well, treatment is really important. If you look at the numbers, there's 46 million Americans over age 12 today that suffer from at least one substance use disorder. 46 million Americans. Any given day, there's about 2 million Americans incarcerated. 60 to 80% based on our data have at least one substance use disorder. So we figured out, let's put people behind walls, and then when they come out, the likelihood of death from overdose is 40-fold higher in the next several days to weeks of being released when they're suffering from addiction. So this is why it's important to make sure that we're focused on high-risk populations, people who are suffering from addiction, but also people who are behind the walls. And that's why we're looking at now providing treatment to every individual who needs it in federal, 122 had federal facilities, but at the same time, CMS has offered these 1115 waivers for states to apply for treatment 90 days before discharge from jails and prisons for any state to be able to do that. Similarly, President called for removing barriers to care. So what used to happen is you have a DEA license as a practitioner. You could prescribe as much as opioids you want, but then if you want to treat somebody for that addiction, then you have to get an extra license. It's called X-waiver. So I used to have both. And finally now we don't have that extra license requirement. So we've expanded the treatment of doctors from 129,000 to 2 million doctors now who can prescribe treatment. And then of course affordability is important, and making sure that whomever you are as a provider, you're screening people for addiction, because 16% of American population suffers from addiction. So it's going to be really important that we double down on the ability to get help to people at a time when we are putting unprecedented resources towards that.
The value of international partnerships should not be understated here in terms of the fight against illicit drugs. In the Western Hemisphere specifically, it seems as though some of our partners are a little bit less enthusiastic than we are, I should say, about continuing the partnership the same way we have in the past. So how are you all approaching the current moment that we're in now, where it seems as though some of our partners are a little bit less enthusiastic about the interdiction side of things than they have been in the past?
Yeah, I think it's important that why are they sometimes they have lost enthusiasm in this space. Oftentimes it's because they have seen the United States not focus enough on its demand side. And they often would say, this is the reason the problem is yours. I think it's important to have that genuine commitment towards reduced demand reduction that we're doing now. It allows us to have the credibility and the credence to be able to engage with our partners, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So when we speak with President Lopez Obrador, for example, or in Mexico, or President Petro in Colombia, we're able to say, we understand what you're saying. We're doing X, Y, and Z to expand treatment and availability to help people. But you're also going to be having, if you don't already, a synthetics problems in your country. So you might want to figure out how to work with us on some of these things. And we generally get a positive response because I think Western hemp countries, as others, recognize the problem and the danger of synthetics, in addition to that of traditional plant-based drugs as well now. And it's our duty also to make them aware of the emerging threats that happen.
You've given me a perfect segue into discussing Mexico, which is one of the partner countries that I wanted to talk about most. My question revolves around our security cooperation with Mexico, which, from a public observer's perspective, seems to be at I would say, a challenging point in time. How can we manage relations with the AMLO government? Many of us in the room saw the conversation, particularly around fentanyl, the denial of Mexico as a place where fentanyl is processed, and so on. Give us some insight into the management of that challenging relationship.
A lot of times when relationships are based on personalities, they can be challenging. But what becomes important is the relationship between the leaders of those nations, and there's a lot of respect that exists between President Biden and President Lopez Obrador. It is, the work has to continue, and therefore, what we try to do, and we have a working relationship with Mexico, is to continue to push whether it's the issues that they care about, which is gun trafficking, weapons trafficking, cash, and others, or the issues that is the production of fentanyl and other synthetics, and make sure they're doing everything. I mean, it is not a surprise that soon after our visit in March, President Lopez Obrador sent a letter to President Xi Jinping to ask him to stop sending fentanyl to Mexican ports. And he was told that wasn't the case, and he was able to find fentanyl coming from PRC and have a conversation follow up from that. So I do think there's progress gets made. Maybe it's not at the speed or the rate that we would like to see, especially at a time when an American is dying every 5 minutes. But at the same time, I think it is important to involve the global nature and understand the global nature. So whether it's the participation of Mexico with Canada in North American drug dialogue, which we had a successful public health summit recently at the White House, or ensuring that Mexico is becoming a partner that helps to see things together, because there are people in Mexico, especially around their northern border, that are dying of fentanyl poisoning and overdoses. So it is important that we highlight that for them too, that it's a mutual challenge and a mutual concern.
Another critical country when it comes to the interdiction part of this, and with which we have to have a relationship, is the PRC. We mentioned it at the top of the event, but I want to drill down a little bit on the PRC, which has shown a willingness at times to pull back from some of that cooperation, withhold cooperation, or subject it to whatever's going on in the bilateral relationship and to strategic competition. So how does great power competition affect the partnerships that you're trying to deepen for the purposes of ONDCP?
You know, what is interesting is at a time when there is great power competition, sometimes counter-narcotic strategy is what brings countries closer. It was in 2019, the previous administration, when the PRC decided to control fentanyl as a substance. And we saw the drop of fentanyl shipments to nearly zero. But that didn't stop the precursor shipments, and that they began. So I do think sometimes it is these issues which we all understand to be a global challenge, that we find ways to come together and a way to address it as a way to make progress within that great power competition. So the United States has always have had a open hand approach in inviting the PRC to help on these issues, predominantly because that's where most of the precursors are being shipped from. And we think that there's a lot they can do about it. We're wanting them to be involved in not just the global coalition that's coming up next month, but further conversations so we can have this working group moving. And at the end of the day, it's a challenge that we all face together. It's one that we can agree that that those bad actors need to be weeded away from the system.
Finally, I want to come back to asking you about Colombia. So moving from the synthetics to the plant-based, back to the traditional plant-based. I mentioned in my opening remarks that Colombia has seen some record levels of coca cultivation in recent years, even as President Petro has expressed some criticisms of past counter-narcotics policies from the United States. On the other hand, the United States and Colombia have a historic partnership on narcotics and security issues, among many others. So what does narcotics cooperation with Colombia look like on the ground today?
Well, so it's a historic, as you mentioned, collaboration and cooperation with Colombia, 200 years of history. At the same time, we often ask the Petro government to look at the entire spectrum of cooperation when it comes to counter-narcotics. Part of this is making sure that whether it's eradication, interdiction, or economic development, all of these things are playing an important role, and these are all tools in the toolbox. So it becomes important. For example, we know that if landowners can own their own lands, like titling piece, for example, there's a number of things that are happening right now with our USAID partners are there to get the titling ready to go, so the farmers can own their own lands, and that will help them transition off to more economic alternative crop development and other aspects as well. Those things are important. We certainly like to see more of that happen, because the more we can empower the Colombian people to make good decisions for themselves, I think we're going to see progress. So those are the kind of things that helps both the petro agenda in terms of economic development, but also I think the record levels of production, obviously it's a threat, not just in the United States once again, but a lot of that gets produced and shipped elsewhere, especially in Europe and further on.
Are there areas where the relationship with Colombia could be improved?
Well, certainly. I think, relationships with these countries are complex. Whether there can be, holistic in a play. We continue to have those relationships that rely on both security at a community level, development, economic development, and at the same time having counter-narcotics. Those three elements are important because without security, you can't have economic development in places, especially in some of the most underserved populations within Colombia. I've traveled with the Vice President Marquez into some of the most, where you have the people who've been sort of disregarded for decades, if not hundreds of years. So it's really important to provide that cover of security in order to develop the land, at the same time ensure that illegal activities, whether it's counter-narcotics or mining or other things, are prevented from happening in the first place.
You've got a lot of demands that are placed on you from various agencies, from various individuals, and you're trying to bring a whole-of-government approach to be effective. What ways is ONDCP working to improve coordination within the interagency process, as well as with Congress? Because you've got members making demands of you as well, calling you, I'm sure, all the time.
Well, thank you for that question. I've always found in my career that the real secret sauce is about relationships. And if you have good relationships, you're able to oftentimes find resolutions to some of the most difficult issues. So there's no doubt that these tough issues, whether it's within interagency or with individual members of Congress or with other stakeholders, come up. I think if we continue to be reminded of the goal, which is saving lives, is the North Star. It is for this administration, and it is for our team and all of the interagency. We're going to make progress. If you look at the 2022 overdose death numbers compared to 2021, we've averted about 19,000 deaths. There's 19,000 Americans, in our estimation, who are at the dinner table today if it wasn't for the Biden-Harris policies in place. I think this is a perfect time to double down on those policies, to fully implement those. And I have certainly seen, members of Congress as being partners that they can help us get there. It's a bipartisan issue. It affects us. It's not a red state issue or a blue state issue. This is America's issue because most of us know people who've been impacted by this.
That's a perfect point for me to segue into my next question, which was exactly about this, a bipartisan consensus. Lives are at stake, as you mentioned quite rightly. Are you getting the bipartisan consensus that you want? Because there might be the disagreements on the policy or on the funding levels, on other things. Are you getting broad-based buy-in across Republicans and Democrats so that policy can be in place for years to come without whipsaw between two ends?
I mean, there's always going to be disagreements, so I will not sugarcoat this. Yeah. The important piece is to get in a room, put our politics outside, and actually talk about it. So, for instance, some of the toughest issues, like the border, it's really important when we're having those private conversations to be able to agree that majority of these drugs are flowing through the ports of entry, and they're coming through commercial and private traffic and some foot traffic. We have technology in place today that if it can be implemented at all of our ports of entry, we can drastically reduce the amount of drugs, make it more expensive for traffickers to produce and traffic these drugs, and those are common sense policies. We got to have technology, artificial intelligence put to use for the American people. But I think part of this is also, I see it as my job, and our job is to be able to have those conversations and putting politics aside. So I think so. I think we are making progress. Some of the policies, like removal of the X-waiver, expanding treatment behind the walls, are really not only good policies, but they're smart policies because they allow us to save more lives faster. Because I look at this as, frankly, as a race against time. Every 5 minutes, American is dying. To me, faster we can move, the more lives will be saved. That's as simple as that.
One thing I've noticed in following your work since the start of the administration is that you've done a very good job of covering all the possible angles. There's the human lives at stake, there's the economic prosperity argument, there's the national security argument. So to the point about the bipartisan consensus, hopefully there's something there for every potential, say, member of Capitol Hill, whether they're more attracted to the saving lives part or the national security part, the economic prosperity part. I think you're really trying to make the argument from all perspectives. Two things that haven't come up in this conversation, and then we're going to turn to Q&A. The first is silencing, right? Tell us a bit about that threat, because we've talked about fentanyl, we've talked about synthetics, but those of us who are paying attention to this issue have seen this. I think, this is, as I understand it, a veterinarian drug, which we've seen hitting our streets. What's the current status and what's the approach of ONDCP?
So, Ryan, you're right. Xylazine is an animal tranquilizer or a sedative for large animals oftentimes. And what has been happening, when I visited Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia, that it's being mixed in with fentanyl. And fentanyl mixed in xylazine is so much more dangerous. It makes fentanyl use look like a walk in the park. It is not only a terrible drug, on the one side it makes the high longer, that's what the claims are, makes it more feel like heroin use, but on the other hand, it lowers your blood pressure, your heart rate, it's a sedative, and then it has these terrible wounds that I've never seen before in a way that they are now. But when I was on the ground for so many years practicing, I've seen it when I would have a visit from an opioid sort of manufacturers every day, if not once a week or twice a week, leave samples. And then I saw when it turned into street heroin and then fentanyl. And I would always think, why aren't we able to get ahead of it? And that was one of the reasons why on April 12th, we declared xylazine mixed with fentanyl as an emerging threat. And part of that reason is to get ahead of it. We're seeing increases in deaths and increases in prevalence of this mixture. So it's important that we figure out how do we get more testing for it, more treatment available. That treatment doesn't exist as of right now. Antidotes developed, and how we accomplish something that we haven't, frankly, failed to do in the past, to move fast and help save more lives.
One more question before we turn to Q&A. It's about Narcan. The significance of having that over the counter. So as most folks know, naloxone or training Narcan oftentimes, but there are other products as well. These are opioid overdose reversal medications, and they save some lives basically. And you cannot get into treatment or recovery if you're already dead. So this is something that I look at very similar to defibrillators. Being available over the counter is another tool in the toolbox. It makes available now for schools and businesses and restaurants to have this available right next to the defibrillator. It is important that we make this drug available as widely as possible, especially in high-risk groups, affordable as possible, because that translates right directly into saving lives, and then we've got to help people. It doesn't end there. You've got to help people get into treatment subsequently as well. Just to remind folks, if you want to ask a question based on something you've heard today, we've got the QR code above me here. Go ahead, snap a photo of it, and put your question into your phone. And if you're watching us online, you've got a button on the event webpage that says Ask Live Questions. I'm going to go to my CSIS America's colleague, Henry Ziemer, who's our program coordinator and research assistant in the back, He's got some questions for us, and we've got a full 15 minutes for Q&A. Dr. Gupta. Henry.
Thank you, Ryan. Our first question comes to us from Chris with the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, who asks that new border tech is a meaningful way to promote commercial disruption abroad, but a focus on commercial disruption within the United States is also imperative. U.S. businesses are required licensure and periodic inspections to operate. For example, car makers need to have seatbelts and airbags, and restaurants must pass health inspections. So how can we immediately regulate social media companies to implement reasonable safeguards and stop online drug trafficking to prevent innocent users from falling victim to the harms of fentanyl poisoning?
Thank you.
Full question.
That's a great question, actually. You may know that the president talked about it in his State of the Union, and he called out that we must do more. We're having meetings at the White House right now with some of the big tech companies and directly asking, what can you do now, and what can we do along with you, as well as what can Congress do to regulate. The fact is that there used to be where you go to a street corner and you exchange for money or whatever drugs. That platform is changing to now in the palm of your hand. Oftentimes, adolescents are ordering what they think is Adderall or Xanax, and then ending up in a terrible number dying from it. So there's an accountability aspect here. We are engaged. It couldn't happen sooner, but I can tell you, and the commitment is to make sure that we're working every way possible with the entire interagency to both influence, but also see what can we do to working with the social media companies as well as with Congress. Great question.
Have you seen high levels of voluntary compliance so far? Do social media companies want to partner with you on this issue?
I mean, yes, every time we talk with them, there's a lot of list of what they are doing. So if you compare that to 2 years ago, absolutely there's more being done. I would say that. The question becomes, is sufficient work being done now to refer to law enforcement, to work within themselves so a trafficker isn't jumping from one platform to another one. So that coordination needs to happen as opposed to one individual company. And so those are the things we're looking at right now to see. And then how do we, look, we've had success. If you look at the terrorism aspect of this, child pornography, counterproliferation, we've had success in this area. So nothing less acceptable in this area as well.
Let's go to our second question.
Our next question comes from Juan Cruz, a senior advisor at the CSIS Americas program, who asks that the pursuit of precursors and the disruption of supply chains is not an easy proposition and relies on good intelligence, as well as a host of private sector and nation partners to help distinguish between legitimate and criminal destinations. Outside of sanctions and other sticks, how do we incentivize potential nation partners to get behind the plan you've described and contribute to our objectives at a time when they will be reluctant to get involved in any activities that might negatively impact legal businesses and may have unintended consequences? What's in it for them?
Thank you, Juan. That's a good question. I think what's in it for them is their credibility. If you look at the PRC as an example, they have thousands of chemical companies that ship chemicals, precursors to the entire world. And I think it's a matter of them maintaining their credibility and not giving space to illegal and criminal actors within the country. That's what's in it for them. What we're proposing in terms of those asks, know your customer, proper labeling, as well as having an idea of what's being shipped in volumes, a common sense approach. It's not any different than we would want to do it ourselves. So this is the lowest common denominator at which we can work with countries, and this is exactly why we're moving towards having a global coalition against synthetics, in which 80 nations have been invited next month to begin that process to make sure that every country is part of the solution.
Next question. I believe we have Ambassador Wayne. You want to ask a question in person? Your phone is not working, so go
I
ahead.
couldn't get my phone to work.
Okay, Ambassador Wayne couldn't get his phone to work. This is a rare exception, folks, where Ambassador Wayne is going to jump on the
Thank you
mic.
for the exception.
Go ahead, Ambassador Wayne.
So indeed, one of the challenges, both serving as an ambassador overseas, but also serving back in Washington, is to get all the U.S. law enforcement agencies to actually talk to each other and coordinate with each other and not compete with each other. Could you say a little bit about steps that you're taking to try to facilitate that progress in this area, which is a long-standing challenge in the USG? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You know this, and most folks know this. When I talk about commercial disruption, we've launched a strategic implementation plan behind commercial disruption out of the National Security Council, and that's the intent. The intent is to have unity of effort. Every agency has, obviously, if you think about it, look, did not expect to be a time where precursors were being shipped, not drugs, but precursors, which are potentially dual use and legal until they're not. And oftentimes they may be shipped directly or they may be co-opted on the high seas and goes. This requires very much an expertise in the ability to get that intel and be able to interdict and oftentimes not even be able to prosecute because they may never had the intention to be misused to begin with. We need entire law enforcement community to work together on these areas now more than ever before. And it's with that intention that we launched the strategic implementation plan to make sure, and it's a lot of hard work that went behind it, as you know, oftentimes happens, to get everybody to come together to the table and make sure that we're all, one can have the lead, but everybody else participates. And this is the new thing. This is the important part, is to go after the profits first and foremost, and the operating capital through this commercial disruption aspect. We're excited about it. We think this is the way to go forward. And obviously, we depend on our law enforcement partners to be good partners with each other.
Okay, next question. Back to Henry.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jeremy with Beacon Global Strategies, who notes that you mentioned the use of scanners and other advanced technology at ports of entry to intercept drugs. What specific technologies will help the U.S. government with its commercial supply disruption campaign?
Well, so one of the things I've talked about is the non-intrusive inspection technology. If we have that, by the way. I mean, the challenge now what we're working through is to put that in at least 123 sites, ports of entry right now, to make sure that every port of entry is able to have that, and every vehicle that needs to be screened is screened for that. And if we combine that with artificial intelligence, I think it's going to be fairly sort of the best use of technology in a way to be able to estimate, not only screen and gauge of when and where you can expect that to happen in terms of trafficking. I think it's going to be important. Other aspects come in, and it is much easier in the way to estimate crops and fields. It's much harder to figure out the closet in which production of fentanyl is happening. That's another aspect that emerging technologies could help us with, having those signatures and other aspects as well. But again, this is an open field. But bottom line is we've got to use technology to use for the American people and for the world in this area as well.
Next question.
Our next question comes to us from Yulia with Florida International University, who notes that authorities in Central America are worried about the threat of synthetic drugs, but often lack the resources and technical capacity for drug detection, testing, and treatment. How does the United States engage with forensic chemists and drug observatories in these countries to support them?
That's a great question, Julia. When we were in Vienna in March at CND, and we had a G7 plus sort of dinner to engage a variety of countries to conceive of the global coalition, this is one of the things we talked about, that how could we help countries across to what we call that public health surveillance, but we could also call it like the best practices in being able to detect these precursors and synthetics early on, so that those countries, if you don't know what you're dealing with, you don't know what you're dealing with. So I think that technical assistance, whether it's the at the UN or otherwise, it's going to be important to be able to provide that to those laboratories to know what's coming, the variety of chemicals. Now, I'll just extend to also say at the same time, this is precisely the reason that we've included harm reduction in approach for the first time in any federal policy. And $400 million behind it, the President has proposed $500 million for his 24 budget, being that you're able to test for fentanyl and xylazine on the ground in your drug supply as well. So that applies not only to the labs, but also applies to individuals who are often unwitting, thinking that their drug supply may or may not have these, end up dying. So it's the same thing that happens at human level as it happens at laboratory level.
I think we might have time for one more. I've got my eye on the clock and make sure we get Dr. Gupta back to the White House in good time. One more, Henry.
Absolutely. Our final question comes from Dr. Mary Speck with the U.S. Institute of Peace, who notes that the ONDCP was created to both develop and implement counter-narcotic strategy across the government, but it has never had the clout to do so. Are you seeking new tools and authorities to implement a whole of government strategy and potentially return to cabinet status?
Well, thank you. That's an important question. The Support Act that authorizes the office is up for re-auth this year. And one of the things we're working on is to evaluate just all that right now internally and be able to have that conversation with Congress around what has worked in the last 5 years, what has not worked. So I like to be very clear about that in a way that all our leaders in ONDCP and across the agencies, obviously re-auth is important, but figuring out where things could be better is even more important at a time when, again, this is come at a crisis level. So we're looking at it, evaluating that. We're doing it right now. We're having regular meetings. And we certainly do think, though, with the current authority, that we are bringing the interagency together on more issues and more topics and getting those answers, than in several prior administrations. So, great.
Well, with that, I want to close. But before I close, I want to both thank Dr. Gupta for coming and also say that we do a lot of things here at CSIS which are very theoretical. We talk about geopolitics, we talk about deterrence, we talk about all these, these fancy things in the international relations arena. This is one of the most human-centric conversations that we're going to have at CSIS. So I thank you very much for coming, Dr. Gupta. Thanks for shedding light on the administration's strategy. Thanks for your service as well in this very important endeavor that we're all undertaking together as a nation. Very few of us have been unaffected by this, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to you, Ryan, and CSIS for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.